The night was dark and heavy with the kind of storm that made the entire city seem like it was drowning. Sheets of rain pounded the pavement, turning streets into rivers, and the wind whipped between the buildings, carrying the echoes of the storm's fury. It was the kind of night that made people stay inside, safe and warm, behind locked doors and drawn curtains. But for Ethan, there was no warmth to return to. He was just 13, but the city had already shaped him into something tougher, more guarded than any boy his age should be. Beneath the rusted awning of an old, abandoned shop, Ethan crouched low, knees tucked to his chest, trying to make himself as small as possible. His jacket, too thin to provide real protection, clung to his soaked skin, and every gust of wind sent a new wave of shivers down his spine. His messy dark hair stuck to his forehead, and his eyes, wide with a mix of fear and weariness, darted back and forth, watching the empty streets as if something might jump out from the shadows. The world felt impossibly large, and Ethan felt impossibly small. He had been on his own for what seemed like forever, though he had stopped counting the days a long time ago. The streets were his home, the hidden corners and back alleys his only refuge. And on nights like this, the rain seemed to wash away any lingering hope he had. Just as he was beginning to drift into a restless sleep, a scream tore through the night. It was distant, but unmistakable, sharp and full of panic. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. His first instinct was to ignore it, to stay put. The streets were dangerous, especially at night, and he had learned early on to mind his own business. Whatever had happened wasn't his problem. But the scream was desperate, filled with a kind of terror that pierced through the storm and reached straight into Ethan's chest. He couldn't ignore it. Swallowing hard, Ethan stood up, his legs trembling. He couldn't remember the last time he had been this scared. Slowly, he stepped out from under the awning and into the rain. The cold water immediately soaked through his shoes, chilling him to the bone, but he pushed forward, heading toward the source of the scream. The alley was dark, barely lit by the dim streetlights that flickered on and off as the storm raged. Ethan hesitated at the mouth of the alley, peering into the shadows. He could see a shape on the ground, crumpled and unmoving. His heart pounded in his ears as he took a cautious step forward, and then another. When he was close enough, he saw the figure more clearly, a man, older, lying in the rain-soaked alley. He was clutching his side, his face twisted in pain, his breath shallow and uneven. For a moment, Ethan thought about turning back. This wasn't his problem. He wasn't a doctor, he wasn't a hero, he was just a kid, barely surviving on his own. But something inside him wouldn't let him walk away. Maybe it was the man's frailty, or maybe it was the way he groaned, helpless and alone. Ethan knew that feeling all too well. "Hey," Ethan's voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse. He crouched down next to the man, unsure of what to do. The man's eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain, and he tried to speak, but only managed a weak groan. "I fell," the man finally croaked. "I think something's broken." Ethan's mind raced. He needed help. Real help. But how? He wasn't sure where to start. His gaze dropped to the man's jacket, and he noticed the outline of something bulky in the pocket. With trembling fingers, Ethan reached for it, pulling out a phone. The screen was cracked, but it still worked. His hands shook as he dialed the emergency number, unsure if this was the right thing to do. When the operator picked up, Ethan's voice wavered. There's a man. He's hurt. He fell. I don't know what to do." The operator's calm voice guided him through the next steps, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like maybe, just maybe, things might be okay. The sense of responsibility that weighed on him in that moment was foreign but undeniable. He had chosen to help, and now he couldn't walk away. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and finally, the distant wail of an ambulance cut through the storm. Ethan stepped back as the paramedics rushed in, working quickly to assess the man's injuries. They loaded him onto a stretcher, moving with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of practice. As they prepared to leave, the man, his face pale and drawn, turned his gaze toward Ethan, eyes full of gratitude. His hand reached out weakly, and Ethan, unsure of what else to do, took it. "Come with me," the man whispered, his voice hoarse. "Please." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. Go with him? Why would he? But something in the man's voice, in the pleading look in his eyes, made Ethan hesitate. He had no one waiting for him. No place to return to. And, in a way, neither did this man. "Okay," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely audible above the rain. And just like that, his world shifted. He climbed into the back of the ambulance, the doors closing behind him, shutting out the storm. The rain continued to pour, but for the first time in a long time, Ethan wasn't alone. Inside the ambulance, the world felt small and suffocating. The lights above were bright and harsh, a stark contrast to the dark, rain-soaked streets outside. The paramedics worked quickly, talking in low, efficient voices as they tended to the old man. Ethan sat in the corner, knees drawn up to his chest, feeling out of place and unsure. His heart raced, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. The old man, Mr. Lawson, as the paramedics had called him, lay still on the stretcher, his face pale and lined with pain. His breaths were shallow, and his body trembled with every bump and turn the ambulance made as it rushed through the city. Ethan's eyes kept flicking toward him, unsure if Mr. Lawson was going to make it. A strange sense of responsibility weighed heavy on Ethan's chest. He didn't know this man, not really, but there was something about the way Mr. Lawson had looked at him, something in the frailty of his body that had stirred a long-buried instinct in Ethan. It was like seeing a reflection of his own helplessness, the same vulnerability he had felt every day on the streets. And that made it impossible to walk away. As they sped through the rain, one of the paramedics glanced at Ethan. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice calm but concerned. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure he was telling the truth. His throat was dry, and his mind was still reeling from everything that had just happened. "Is he going to be all right?" he asked, his voice small. The paramedic's face softened slightly. "He's in good hands now. We'll do everything we can. You did the right thing by calling us." The words should have brought Ethan some comfort, but they didn't. Instead, they made the knot in his stomach tighten. What if Mr. Lawson didn't make it? What if all this had been for nothing? He had no idea why the man had asked him to come along, or what he was supposed to do now that he was here. The ambulance pulled up to the hospital, and the paramedics quickly wheeled Mr. Lawson inside. Ethan hesitated at the doors, unsure if he should follow. He could still leave, disappear back into the night, slip away before anyone asked too many questions. But Mr. Lawson had asked him to stay. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, Ethan found himself stepping through the doors, into the sterile, unfamiliar world of the hospital. The smell of disinfectant hit him first, sharp and overwhelming. The hallways were a blur of white coats and buzzing machines, of hurried footsteps and low, urgent voices. It felt alien, a world so far removed from the cold streets he was used to. But Ethan followed the paramedics as they wheeled Mr. Lawson into an examination room. They moved with a speed and precision that made Ethan feel even more out of place, like a lost kid stumbling into something far beyond his understanding. He stood in the corner, his hands fidgeting with the edges of his worn-out jacket as doctors and nurses surrounded Mr. Lawson, checking his vitals, assessing his injuries. It was clear from their hushed conversations that the fall had been serious, possible fractures, internal injuries. Ethan's stomach churned with guilt. He should have found him sooner. What if the old man had been lying there for hours before he found him? As the medical team worked, Mr. Lawson stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He blinked groggily, disoriented by the bright lights, before his gaze found Ethan standing quietly in the corner. Despite the pain etched across his face, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "You're still here," Mr. Lawson said, his voice weak but warm. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. "Yeah," he mumbled. I didn't know if I should go." Mr. Lawson chuckled softly, though the sound quickly turned into a painful cough. "No. I'm glad you stayed." His voice was barely more than a whisper, but there was a gratitude in his tone that made Ethan's chest tighten. The doctors worked quickly to stabilize Mr. Lawson, and soon he was moved to a quieter room, away from the chaos of the emergency ward. Ethan followed, keeping his distance but never straying too far. He wasn't sure why he stayed. Maybe it was because, for the first time in as long as he could remember, someone had asked him to. In the quiet of the hospital room, Ethan sat in a chair near the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Mr. Lawson lay in the bed, his breathing steadier now, though he still looked fragile and worn. The beeping of the machines was the only sound in the room, steady and rhythmic, a reminder that things weren't as hopeless as they seemed. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Lawson spoke again. His voice was still weak, but his eyes were clearer now, less clouded with pain. "You saved me, you know," he said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "I just found you. That's all." "No, you did more than that," Mr. Lawson insisted, his gaze fixed on Ethan. "You didn't have to stop. You could have kept walking. But you didn't." Ethan shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the praise. He wasn't a hero. He was just a kid who had stumbled upon an old man in an alley. But the way Mr. Lawson looked at him, with such sincerity, made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of worth. Like maybe he mattered after all. They sat in silence for a while, the rain continuing its relentless assault on the city outside. Ethan's mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. He had no idea what he was supposed to do next. He had no home to go back to, no one waiting for him. And yet, for the first time, that emptiness didn't feel quite so unbearable. Eventually, Mr. Lawson spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I don't have anyone," he said softly, his words laced with a kind of sadness that Ethan recognized all too well. "No family. No one to come for me." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Me neither," he admitted, though the words felt strange on his tongue. He wasn't used to sharing his story with anyone. For a long moment, they sat in the silence of that shared loneliness, two strangers bound together by the quiet understanding of what it meant to be alone in the world. Then, in a voice so soft that Ethan almost didn't hear him, Mr. Lawson asked, "Would you stay with me? Just, until I'm better?" Ethan stared at him, the question hanging in the air between them. The idea of staying with Mr. Lawson, of having somewhere to belong, even if only for a little while, was both terrifying and exhilarating. He had spent so long surviving on his own that the thought of relying on someone else, of letting someone care for him, felt almost impossible. But something in Mr. Lawson's eyes made it hard to say no. There was a kind of quiet hope there, a flicker of something Ethan hadn't seen in a long time. I guess I could," Ethan said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. And in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't just about Mr. Lawson anymore. For the first time, Ethan felt like he might not have to face the world alone. The hospital room was dimly lit, the quiet beeping of machines filling the air as Ethan sat beside Mr. Lawson's bed. Days had passed since the night of the accident, and though Mr. Lawson was stable, the looming uncertainty of the court hearing weighed heavily on both of them. They had been through so much already, but now, everything hinged on one final, nerve-wracking event, the hearing that would determine if Ethan could stay with Mr. Lawson or be sent back into the unknown. The day arrived, cold and overcast. As Ethan and Mr. Lawson made their way to the courthouse, Ethan's stomach churned with anxiety. The grand stone building loomed ahead, its heavy doors a gateway to the unknown. Ethan's mind raced with fear and doubt. What if the judge didn't believe in their bond? What if they sent him away? The thought was unbearable. He had only just found Mr. Lawson, found a glimmer of hope, and now he could lose it all. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. Ethan sat beside Mr. Lawson, his hands clammy and his heart pounding in his chest. The courtroom itself felt like a cold, unfriendly place, with its stern wooden benches and the judge's high, imposing seat. The walls seemed to close in on him as they waited for the proceedings to begin. Ms. Williams, their social worker, offered a reassuring smile, but even she seemed nervous. This wasn't just a legal matter, it was their future on the line. the air felt thick with unspoken fears. Then, the doors opened, and the judge entered, her presence immediately commanding the room. She was a sharp-eyed woman with a stern expression, and as she sat down at the bench, Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. The case began, with Ms. Williams speaking first. She outlined the story, how Ethan had found Mr. Lawson that fateful night, how they had formed a bond, and how both of them had become each other's lifeline. Her words were measured, careful, but Ethan could hear the emotion beneath them. This was more than just a story to her, she believed in their connection. But as Ms. Williams finished, the judge's expression remained unreadable, and Ethan's fear grew. What if it wasn't enough? Then came the turn for Mr. Lawson to speak. His frail voice filled the room, steady despite the strain it must have taken for him to sit upright, his legs still in a cast. His words were quiet but full of emotion. He spoke about the loneliness he had felt before Ethan came into his life, about how he had lost everything that mattered to him, his family, his sense of purpose. "I was ready to give up," Mr. Lawson said, his voice trembling slightly. "But that night, when Ethan found me, he didn't just save my life. He gave me a reason to keep going. I don't have anyone else, but I have him now. And I'm asking this court to give me the chance to be the family he deserves." There was a pause. The silence that followed was so heavy, Ethan could feel it pressing down on his chest. Mr. Lawson's words hung in the air, and the judge sat quietly, her face still betraying nothing. Then, it was Ethan's turn. The moment he had dreaded the most. His palms were sweaty, his throat dry as he stood up, all eyes in the room suddenly on him. His legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but he forced himself to speak. I don't know how to say all this," Ethan began, his voice barely above a whisper. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might drown out his words. "But I've been alone for as long as I can remember. I didn't think anyone cared whether I lived or died. I was just surviving." He swallowed hard, glancing at Mr. Lawson, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "When I found Mr. Lawson, I wasn't trying to be a hero. I saw someone who needed help. And in helping him, I found something I didn't know I needed. A home. A family." His voice cracked, and he quickly looked down, fighting the tears that were threatening to spill over. "I don't want to go back to being alone. I finally feel like I belong somewhere. I finally have someone who cares about me. Please, don't take that away." The courtroom fell into a thick, deafening silence. Ethan's heart raced, each second feeling like an eternity. He dared to glance at the judge, her expression still impossibly calm, and his hope wavered. Then, something unexpected happened. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and a tall, stern man in a dark suit entered. He approached the bench, whispering something to the judge, his voice too low for anyone else to hear. The judge nodded, her sharp eyes flicking to Mr. Lawson, then to Ethan, before she looked down at her notes. Ethan's breath hitched as the judge straightened, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Before I make my ruling, I have been informed of certain complications," the judge said, her voice firm and unyielding. "It appears that there are concerns regarding Mr. Lawson's health and his ability to care for Ethan long-term." Ethan's heart dropped. No. This couldn't be happening. After everything they had gone through, after finally finding hope, was it all going to be taken away because of Mr. Lawson's age and condition? The judge continued, her tone sharp. "However, this court also recognizes the importance of family, and the undeniable bond that has formed between Ethan and Mr. Lawson. Both have testified to the significance of that bond, and this court does not take that lightly." Ethan held his breath. Everything hung in the balance now. Every word she spoke felt like a swing of a pendulum, teetering between hope and despair. The issue at hand is whether Mr. Lawson, despite his medical condition, can provide a stable home for Ethan. After much consideration, I have decided to grant Mr. Lawson temporary guardianship, under the condition that both receive regular visits from social services to ensure Ethan's well-being and that Mr. Lawson's health is not compromised. A rush of air left Ethan's lungs. Temporary guardianship. He wasn't being sent away. He wasn't losing Mr. Lawson. But the judge wasn't finished. This arrangement will be revisited in 6 months. If at that time, the conditions have been met, and Mr. Lawson has shown he can adequately care for Ethan, the court will consider permanent guardianship. Relief washed over Ethan like a flood, his knees nearly buckling as he sat back down beside Mr. Lawson. They hadn't won entirely, but they had a chance. A chance to prove that they could make this work, a chance to build the life they both wanted so desperately. Mr. Lawson reached out, squeezing Ethan's hand tightly. His eyes were filled with tears, but there was also pride in them. They had fought for this moment, and now, for the first time, they had hope. As the judge stood and the courtroom began to clear, Ms. Williams approached them, her smile soft and full of warmth. "You both did incredibly well. This isn't the end, it's the beginning of something wonderful." Ethan nodded, his heart still pounding, but the fear had finally begun to lift. He wasn't going back to the streets. He wasn't going to be alone anymore. He had a home. He had a future. And, more importantly, he had Mr. Lawson by his side. Together, they left the courthouse, stepping out into the cool afternoon air. The sky was still overcast, but there was a break in the clouds, a sliver of sunlight shining down on them as they walked. And for the first time in his life, Ethan didn't feel like the world was closing in on him. For the first time, he felt free. The hospital loomed large and intimidating as Ethan walked through its halls once again. Days had passed since that stormy night when he had found Mr. Lawson in the alley, but it felt like an entire lifetime. Now, he sat in the corner of a small rehabilitation room, watching as Mr. Lawson rested in bed, his leg wrapped in a thick cast that propped him up awkwardly. The room was quieter now, with the steady beep of machines and the soft hum of the hospital's background noises the only sound around them. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. He had been staying at a nearby shelter for the time being, though he spent most of his time here with Mr. Lawson. The nurses had come to recognize him, always offering a small smile or a nod, but he could tell they didn't quite know what to make of him. He was, after all, just a boy who had appeared out of nowhere, with no home or family to speak of. Mr. Lawson's recovery was slow but steady. He had suffered multiple fractures in his leg, along with a few cracked ribs, but the doctors were optimistic that he would heal with time. Still, as each day passed, Ethan felt the growing weight of uncertainty. The social worker, Ms. Williams, had been kind, but the process of figuring out whether Ethan could stay with Mr. Lawson was anything but simple. One afternoon, as Ethan sat by the window, staring out at the rain-soaked city beyond, Mr. Lawson broke the silence. "You're quiet today," he observed, his voice soft but filled with warmth. Ethan shrugged, not turning away from the window. "Just thinking." "About what?" Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to put his thoughts into words. "About what happens next. I mean, once you're better. Where do I go?" Mr. Lawson was quiet for a moment, and Ethan finally turned to face him. The old man's face was thoughtful, his eyes filled with a kind of quiet determination. "We've already started the process," Mr. Lawson said. "Ms. Williams is helping us. I want you to stay with me, Ethan." Ethan's chest tightened. He had heard Mr. Lawson say it before, but every time, it felt almost too good to believe. But what if they say no? What if it doesn't work? Mr. Lawson reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and placed it over Ethan's. "Then we keep trying. I'm not giving up on this. You deserve a home, and if I can give you one, I will." Ethan stared at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of Mr. Lawson's touch. It was such a simple gesture, but it meant everything to him. He had spent so long fighting to survive on his own, keeping everyone at arm's length because he couldn't afford to trust anyone. And now, here was this man, who barely knew him, offering him something he had never had before, a place to belong. The sound of a knock on the door interrupted them, and Ms. Williams stepped into the room. She was a tall woman with kind eyes and a calm presence that always seemed to make Ethan feel just a little more at ease. "Good afternoon," she greeted them, offering a warm smile. "I have some news." Ethan's heart leapt into his throat as she approached. He could tell by the look on her face that the news was important, but whether it was good or bad, he couldn't yet tell. Ms. Williams pulled up a chair and sat down beside Mr. Lawson's bed, her eyes flicking between the two of them. "I spoke with the court today," she began, her voice measured. "Mr. Lawson, I know we've discussed your desire to take guardianship of Ethan. The court is considering it, but they've asked for a hearing to determine whether it's in Ethan's best interest." Ethan's stomach twisted. A hearing? It sounded so formal, so final. The thought of standing in front of a judge, having to explain why he deserved to stay with Mr. Lawson, filled him with anxiety. "What does that mean?" Mr. Lawson asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Ms. Williams sighed softly. "It means that the judge will want to hear from both of you. They'll want to understand the bond you've formed, and they'll consider whether it's the best option for Ethan's future. There are a lot of legal details involved, but it's not impossible. In fact, I think you have a strong case." Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. This was it. Everything was going to come down to what happened in that courtroom. Could he really convince a judge that he deserved this chance, that Mr. Lawson was the home he had been searching for? "When is the hearing?" Mr. Lawson asked, his gaze flickering to Ethan. "Next week," Ms. Williams replied. "I'll be there to support both of you, and we'll do everything we can to prepare." The room fell into a heavy silence after that, the weight of what was coming settling over them like a dark cloud. Ethan could feel his nerves building, the anxiety twisting in his gut. He wasn't sure he was ready for this, but deep down, he knew it was their only chance. After Ms. Williams left, Ethan sat quietly for a long time, his thoughts swirling. Mr. Lawson must have sensed his unease because, after a while, he spoke up again. "Ethan," Mr. Lawson said softly, "you've been through more than most people ever will. But you're strong, stronger than you know. Whatever happens in that hearing, we'll face it together." Ethan looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if I mess up? What if the judge doesn't think I'm good enough?" Mr. Lawson's expression softened, and he shook his head. "You've already proven more than enough. It's not about being perfect. It's about being honest. We'll tell the judge the truth, about what we've been through, about what we mean to each other. That's all we can do." Ethan nodded slowly, though the knot in his stomach didn't quite loosen. The thought of standing up in front of a judge, of explaining the bond he had with Mr. Lawson, still terrified him. But there was no turning back now. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. Ms. Williams coached them on what to expect at the hearing, reassuring them that everything would be okay. Ethan listened quietly, doing his best to absorb everything she said, but the anxiety gnawed at him constantly. Mr. Lawson was recovering well, though the doctors insisted he would need to spend more time in rehabilitation before he could fully return home. Despite his physical frailty, his determination never wavered. He was always calm, always steady, and that helped to ground Ethan, even when his fears threatened to overwhelm him. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. Ethan stood outside the courthouse, his heart pounding in his chest. The building towered above him, its stone walls imposing and cold. Mr. Lawson sat beside him in a wheelchair, his legs still in a cast, but his presence was a comforting anchor. Ms. Williams approached them, her smile encouraging but serious. "Are you both ready?" Ethan nodded, though he didn't feel ready at all. He had never been inside a courtroom, and the thought of speaking in front of a judge made his palms sweat. Together, they made their way inside, the courthouse echoing with the sounds of footsteps and murmured conversations. The air was thick with tension, but Ethan kept his focus on Mr. Lawson's calm face, drawing strength from him. When they entered the courtroom, the judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, sat at the bench. The atmosphere was formal, the weight of the moment pressing down on Ethan like a physical force. He could feel every eye in the room on him as they took their seats. Ms. Williams spoke first, outlining their case, explaining the bond that had formed between Ethan and Mr. Lawson. She spoke of the night Ethan had found Mr. Lawson in the alley, of how they had both saved each other in different ways. Her words were kind and careful, and Ethan found himself clinging to them, hoping they would be enough. Finally, it was Ethan's turn to speak. His heart pounded as he stood up, his legs shaky beneath him. The judge's gaze was piercing, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he could find his voice. But then he looked at Mr. Lawson, sitting beside him with that quiet, steady strength, and something inside him settled. I don't really know how to explain everything, Ethan began, his voice quiet but clear. But Mr. Lawson, he's the first person who ever made me feel like I mattered. He didn't have to help me, but he did. And I want to stay with him. I don't want to go back to being alone. The courtroom was silent as Ethan spoke, his words raw and honest. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just telling the truth. When he finished, he sat back down, his heart still racing, but a sense of relief washing over him. He had done it. He had spoken his truth. Now, all they could do was wait. The courtroom was eerily quiet after Ethan finished speaking. His words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable, as he sat back down beside Mr. Lawson. His heart was still pounding, his palms damp with sweat, but there was a strange calmness inside him. He had spoken his truth, and now all they could do was wait for the judge's decision. The judge, her face stern and unreadable, looked down at her papers, shuffling through them in silence. Ethan's stomach churned with anxiety. He kept his eyes focused on the floor, trying not to think too much, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Every second felt like an eternity. Beside him, Mr. Lawson reached out, placing a hand gently on Ethan's shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it steadied him, reminding him that whatever happened next, they would face it together. Ethan glanced at Mr. Lawson, who gave him a reassuring nod. The old man's strength in the face of all this made Ethan feel a little braver, even though the fear still lingered. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the judge cleared her throat, and everyone in the room looked up at her. "I've carefully reviewed the case," she began, her voice firm and measured. "This is a unique situation, and the court takes the well-being of children very seriously. Guardianship is not a decision to be made lightly, especially when it involves a young boy like Ethan who has been through so much." Ethan held his breath, his heart thudding in his chest. He couldn't read the judge's expression, whether she was leaning toward granting their request or not. All he could do was wait. "The bond between Mr. Lawson and Ethan is undeniable," the judge continued. "It is clear to the court that they have formed a relationship based on mutual trust and care, and that both of them have had a positive impact on each other's lives. Ethan has expressed a desire to stay with Mr. Lawson, and Mr. Lawson has demonstrated his commitment to providing a stable and loving home for him." Ethan's heart began to race even faster. Was this a good sign? Was she going to say yes? The judge paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom before settling on Ethan and Mr. Lawson. "It is the opinion of this court that granting Mr. Lawson temporary guardianship of Ethan is in the best interest of the child." For a moment, Ethan couldn't process what she had said. The words seemed to echo in his mind, not quite sinking in. Temporary guardianship. She had said yes. He wasn't going to be sent back to the streets, or placed in foster care. He was going to stay with Mr. Lawson. Ethan's chest tightened with emotion, a mix of relief, joy, and disbelief flooding through him all at once. He felt like he could breathe again for the first time since entering the courtroom. He glanced at Mr. Lawson, who was smiling softly, tears brimming in his eyes. The judge continued, outlining the legal conditions and next steps for making the arrangement more permanent if things went well. But Ethan could barely focus on her words. All that mattered was that he had been given a chance to have a home, to belong somewhere, to finally not be alone. After the hearing ended, they stepped outside the courthouse into the cool afternoon air. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and glistening in the pale sunlight. Ethan stood beside Mr. Lawson's wheelchair, still trying to grasp the reality of what had just happened. It felt surreal, like a dream he wasn't sure he would ever wake from. Ms. Williams came up beside them, a proud smile on her face. "You both did wonderfully in there," she said warmly. "This is just the beginning, but I'm confident everything will work out." Mr. Lawson reached out and shook Ms. Williams' hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. "I couldn't have done this without your help." Ms. Williams nodded, then turned to Ethan. "And you, Ethan. You were brave today. You spoke from the heart, and that's what made the difference." Ethan blushed slightly, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to being praised, and the weight of everything still felt so overwhelming. But deep down, he was proud of himself. He had faced his fears and spoken up for what he wanted, a family, a home, and it had worked. As Ms. Williams left, Ethan and Mr. Lawson lingered outside the courthouse, taking in the fresh air. It felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off Ethan's shoulders, like he could finally breathe freely after years of being suffocated by fear and loneliness. Mr. Lawson looked up at Ethan, his smile warm and full of pride. "I told you we'd face it together, didn't I?" Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah. You did." There was a quiet moment between them, a shared understanding of everything they had been through to get to this point. It wasn't just the court's decision that mattered. It was the bond they had formed, the way they had found each other in the middle of the storm and saved one another. "What do you say we celebrate?" Mr. Lawson suggested, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Maybe we could get some pizza, or whatever you like. Today is a victory for both of us." Ethan grinned, the tension in his chest easing as the realization of their victory began to sink in. "Pizza sounds good." They made their way through the city, the sunlight breaking through the clouds and casting a golden glow over the streets. The world felt different now, less harsh, less cold. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he had a future. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. Later that evening, after they had shared pizza and laughter in Mr. Lawson's cozy little apartment, Ethan sat quietly by the window, watching the sun set over the city. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, and everything felt peaceful. Mr. Lawson sat in his chair nearby, reading a book, but after a while, he looked up and spoke softly. "You know, Ethan, I've been alone for a long time. I never thought I'd find someone who would change my life the way you have." Ethan turned to face him, his heart swelling with emotion. "I never thought I'd find someone who cared," he admitted. "But I'm glad I did." Mr. Lawson smiled, his eyes full of warmth. "We're family now. And no matter what, we'll face everything together." Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of contentment he hadn't known was possible. He had a family now. A home. And for the first time in his life, the future didn't seem so scary. As the last light of the sun disappeared behind the skyline, Ethan leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes and breathing in the quiet peace of the moment. This was what it felt like to belong. This was what it felt like to be home. The days after the court hearing seemed to pass in a peaceful blur, each one blending into the next. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't wake up worrying about where he would sleep or what he would eat. Instead, he woke to the quiet hum of Mr. Lawson's apartment, the soft rustle of pages turning as Mr. Lawson read his morning newspaper, or the smell of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen. It was strange at first, this new routine, this sense of security. For so long, Ethan had lived in survival mode, always watching his back, always prepared for the worst. But now, with Mr. Lawson by his side, the fear that had once been a constant companion seemed to have faded into the background. Slowly, Ethan began to realize that he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning how to live. The apartment, though small and simple, had become a sanctuary for both of them. Its creaky wooden floors, the mismatched furniture, and the warm light that streamed through the windows in the late afternoon, it all felt like home in a way Ethan had never experienced before. There were moments when he still couldn't believe it was real, that he had found a place to belong. Mr. Lawson, with his gentle humor and quiet wisdom, became more than just a guardian. He became a friend, a mentor, and in so many ways, the father figure Ethan had never had. The bond between them deepened with each passing day, and it wasn't long before they settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. One evening, after they had finished dinner, they sat together in the living room, the soft glow of a lamp casting warm light over the room. Mr. Lawson had his leg propped up on the ottoman, still recovering but stronger with each day. Ethan sat on the couch, idly flipping through a book he had picked up from the library, but his mind was elsewhere. As the quiet stretched on, Mr. Lawson glanced up from his own book and noticed Ethan's distracted expression. "You're thinking about something," he said, his voice calm but curious. Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking. "It's just, everything feels so different now." "Good different, but still, different." Mr. Lawson smiled softly, setting his book aside. "I know what you mean. Change can be strange, even when it's for the better." Ethan nodded, trying to find the right words to explain what he was feeling. "I guess I'm just not used to it yet. Being here. Having this." Mr. Lawson leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "You've been through a lot, Ethan. It's only natural that it'll take time to adjust. But you belong here, with me. This is your home now." Home. The word still held a weight Ethan wasn't quite sure he knew how to carry. For so long, the idea of home had been an abstract concept, something other people had but that he could only dream about. And yet, here it was, right in front of him, and it was real. "I never thought I'd find a place like this," Ethan admitted quietly. "I always figured I'd be on my own." Mr. Lawson's expression softened, and there was a tenderness in his eyes that made Ethan's chest tighten. "You're not on your own anymore, kid. We're a team now. And no matter what happens, we'll face it together." Ethan glanced down at his hands, his fingers tracing the edges of the book in his lap. He had spent so many years feeling invisible, like the world had forgotten him. But here, with Mr. Lawson, he felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in his life. After a long pause, he looked up and met Mr. Lawson's gaze. I want you to know how much this means to me. I didn't think anyone would ever care." Mr. Lawson's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and he smiled, his voice thick with emotion. "Ethan, you've brought more joy into my life than I ever could have imagined. I was alone before you found me that night in the alley. You didn't just save me, you gave me a reason to keep going." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized just how much they had both needed each other. It wasn't just about one of them saving the other, it was about two lost souls finding a way to heal together. They sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of their words hanging in the air between them. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled with conversation because everything important had already been said. Later that night, as Ethan lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he thought about how far he had come. He had been so used to running from his past, from the fear of being hurt again, from the belief that he didn't deserve anything good. But now, for the first time, he felt like he didn't have to run anymore. The world still wasn't perfect. He knew that. There would be challenges ahead, and there would still be days when the fear and uncertainty crept back in. But he also knew that he didn't have to face those challenges alone. He had Mr. Lawson. He had a home. And he had hope. And as he drifted off to sleep, the soft hum of the city outside lulling him into a peaceful slumber, Ethan realized that maybe, just maybe, he had found something he had never expected to find, a family. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window, the sunlight streaming through the curtains. He stretched, feeling a sense of calm that was still new but welcome. As he got dressed and walked into the kitchen, he found Mr. Lawson sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in hand and the morning paper spread out before him. "Morning," Ethan said, sliding into the chair across from him. "Morning, kid," Mr. Lawson replied with a smile. "Ready for the day?" Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah. I think I am." And as they sat together, sharing breakfast and conversation, Ethan felt something bloom inside him, a quiet sense of contentment, the kind that comes from knowing that, no matter what, he was exactly where he was meant to be. for the first time in his life, Ethan had found a place where he could grow, where he could be himself without fear. And as he looked at Mr. Lawson, he knew that this was only the beginning of their journey together. They had found each other on a dark, stormy night, two strangers lost in their own worlds of loneliness. But now, they were something more than that. They were a family. And in that moment, Ethan knew that whatever the future held, he wouldn't have to face it alone.